Welcome, everyone. I think, wow, we've got already a good turnout. It's about 44 participants of ours already. I want to welcome everybody to our Palaver series this afternoon. My name is Krista Johnson, and I'm the director of the Center for African Studies at Howard University, and also a professor in the Department of African Studies. So this Palaver series is being organized actually largely by the Department of African Studies, and I want to in particular, thank Dr. Anita Plummer, who is actually our convener of our Palaver series, who really put this all together and has had to kind of exit the stage a little bit at the last minute. But so I'm filling her shoes in that regard. So we're really delighted to bring to you this afternoon a book talk by Professor Robtel Pailey, who is an assistant professor at the London School of Economics in the Department of Social Policy. And we're especially delighted to bring Robtel back to Howard's campus, as she is a distinguished alumna of our department and our program here at Howard University. And so I know we probably have a number of your former professors on the call today who have been really following your career over the past 20 years, probably. And so it's...
Sorry, Krista.
No, of course we can't resist, right? This is...
Hi, Patrick.
How are you?
Yes, I mean, this is a homecoming in so many respects, and it's really a celebration for us in so many respects, because one of our own is really, you know, shining so brightly in her own field, in academia, and in our profession. So it's a delight for us to host Professor Pailey this afternoon. So Professor Pailey has just recently, really literally in the last, I guess, a couple of months, published her first book, her first monograph, which is titled Development, Dual Citizenship and Its Discontents in Africa, the Political Economy of Belonging to Liberia. And the book draws on life histories from over 200 interviews, oral histories that were conducted in West Africa, in Liberia, in Europe, and in North America. And it examines both socioeconomic change and development in Liberia, but through the prism of citizenship and belonging. So we're excited to hear from Dr. Pailey this afternoon and reflect a little bit on her book. We're also joined this afternoon. We actually have the pleasure of having two discussants this afternoon. One is Dr. Carl Patrick Burrowes, who is a distinguished Liberian historian and executive director of Know Yourself Press. He's author of 4 books, including Between the Cola Forest and the Salty Sea, which is a history of the Liberian people before 1800, and he's co-author of the Historical Dictionary of Liberia. Dr. Burrowes' research has received awards from the International Communications Association, the Association for Education in Journalism and Mass Communications. He previously served as vice president for academic affairs at Cuttington University in Liberia and the Carter G. Woodson Distinguished Professor at Marshall University in the United States, and has since retired, as I'm learning, from Penn State University. But most notably, Dr. Burrowes himself is an alum of VHU, Howard University, completed his undergraduate degree here, and then in fact actually he's joined our faculty for a few years, I'm told, as well. So a number of HU connections going on here this afternoon, which is wonderful. And our second discussant, and will also be kind of our facilitator for our Q&A, is Zirra Banu, who is a first-year PhD student with us here at Howard in the Department of African Studies. And we're delighted as well to always include our wonderful cohort of graduate students in these conversations, and Zirra has really, even in this virtual environment, has kind of hit the ground running and has really been instrumental in helping us pull together a number of talks and series and whatnot, and is a real I guess, kind of rising star in our graduate program here in the department. So we're delighted to have you here as well. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Pailey to give about 30 minutes of the kind of overview and discussion of the book and her research. And then we'll have a bit of discussion with Dr. Burrowes and with Zirra as well, before we open it up to the audience for Q&A. Thank you, Robtel.
Thank you so much, Krista, for that very generous introduction. I would also like to thank Anita Plummer for all of her heavy lifting and organizing. Without her, this event would definitely not be possible. I also want to thank the Center for African Studies and the African Studies Department for co-hosting this event. And as Krista mentioned, definitely the African Studies Department was my intellectual foundation. It groomed me into the scholar activist that I am today. And without this department, without Howard University, I would definitely not be where I am in terms of my own trajectory as a scholar. I started at Howard almost 20 years ago, and it feels like the real HU homecoming, right? I definitely want to shout out to my former professors, whom I won't embarrass by naming names, but just to say, you know who you are. Thank you for giving me such an important intellectual foundation and for supporting and encouraging me throughout the past 2 decades. I want to thank Discussants Carl Patrick Burrowes, who is a Liberian intellectual giant on whose shoulders I proudly stand, as well as Zirra Banu, an up-and-coming scholar of Africa, for serving as the discussants today. We have a lot of family and friends on this Zoom webinar, and I won't name all of them by name because it will be impossible to pay homage to everybody. But I do want to say a special thank you to my mother, Neajai Pailey, who basically has allowed me to hibernate in her house for about 6 weeks while I was feverishly finalizing this monograph. And she fed me heaps and heaps and heaps of Liberian food just to fortify me with the energy and the fortitude to continue. So Mom, I love you. Thank you so much for being there and for being my rock. Now I'm going to put all the gushing to the side and actually talk about the book. So I'll start with the outline of the presentation. I will begin by reading an excerpt of the book. I know this is usually not customary for book talks of this nature, academic book talks of this nature, but I'm all about breaking tradition, just to demonstrate how this book is really about contrasts, as well as continuities and discontinuities. In part 2 of the presentation, I want to talk generally about my contributions, what I feel are my theoretical, empirical, as well as methodological contributions. In part 3, I want to talk about the implications of this book and my findings for policymaking and practice, not only in Liberia, but also across the continent writ large. And then in part 4, I want to talk about why I've decided to embark on a 5-country, 5-city, 3-continent launch tour of the book. So first and foremost, I think of myself as a scholar, but I also think of myself as a storyteller. And so this book is infused with my literary sensibilities. Each chapter begins with a vignette or a story. And that vignette is a historical vignette or contemporary vignette from the interviews that I conducted across these different locales. And the vignettes are intended to be a literary or narrative device to really draw the reader in. So I want to do that by beginning to read an excerpt from chapter 1 of the book, which is entitled Methodological, Theoretical, and Biographical Reflections. Now, if you're following along and you happen to have the book with you, I am on page 22. In mid-May 2013, at the Buruburum refugee camp on the outskirts of Accra, Ghana's capital, a petite seamstress hurtled out of a one-room house to fetch rainwater pouring endlessly from her corrugated rooftop. I paused my audio recorder nearly 4 times during an interview with this 38-year-old former refugee who had opted in 2012 for local integration in Ghana after living there for 23 years. Torrential showers splashed through her punctured window screens, exposing us to the elements. Dripping wet, the woman re-entered the house holding a bright blue bucket on the crown of her head, filled with what I assumed was water for washing clothes and bathing, and placed it in a corner of the room. She sat down on a small wooden bench facing me, and we continued the interview, shouting to hear each other above the loud clamor of rain. Just 1 month earlier, I had sat comfortably in a refurbished rooftop office of a 48-year-old Liberian businessman and consultant in downtown Freetown, Sierra Leone's capital. Exuding confidence and privilege, the man had lived and worked in similar settings across 5 different countries within sub-Saharan Africa for 2 decades. When he offered me a chilled orange Fanta in a sleek hourglass bottle, I could not help noticing his form-fitting, tailor-made suit. As the man walked to the single leather recliner facing me, his shiny shoes made a soft noise on the white porcelain tiles. I placed my recorder on his mahogany table and pressed play. So for the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to share my screen now to continue the presentation. Okay, there it is. Okay, so I begin with this vignette because, again, I want to talk about the fact that this book is really about contrast. So it's about contrast between that petite seamstress in a refugee camp in Accra, Ghana, as well as a contrast between the Liberian businessman in Freetown, Sierra Leone. It's also a book about continuity. So the continuities of being a Liberian in Accra, Ghana, and the discontinuities of being a Liberian in Freetown, Sierra Leone. This book is also about contrast between the poor and the prosperous, between the domestic and the diasporic, between the powerful and the powerless, between men and women, between young and old, between the included and the excluded, as well as between citizens and non-citizens. So in terms of my contributions, the first is the case study of Liberia is incredibly unique. So for people who are not familiar with Liberia's history, Liberia was the first Black African republic. And as a result, it was really the first country in the continent of Africa to actually devise legal norms around membership, around citizenship, as well as around belonging. And so this book is the first study that actually investigates both domestic as well as diasporic constructions and practices of Liberian citizenship across space and time, and their myriad implications for development. So development is broadly defined as broader processes of political, economic, and social change. And I do this by using a contested dual citizenship bill that was introduced in Liberia in 2008, but was never passed. It actually lingered in legislative limbo for about 10 years until about 2018. In terms of my major arguments, the first argument that I make is that while mid-19th century to mid-20th century Liberian citizenship was largely passive and constructed from above by a hegemonic state. This is an argument that Carl Patrick Burrowes makes in some of his research. Mid-20th century onwards, Liberian citizenship has actually been active and reconstructed from below by citizens themselves, primarily through protest. And this has happened through historical as well as contemporary processes of conflict, migration, and post-war recovery. So in the case of migration, Liberia was a country of relative immigration, IMMI, when it was established in 1847. Yet what I argue throughout the book is that the citizenship laws and norms were biased against what I call the rooted indigents. So those indigenous populations that lived on the coast as well as in the hinterland, citizenship laws were biased against them. In fact, for the first 100 years of the country's establishment, many indigenous populations were not allowed to have citizenship. What's interesting is that in the 21st century, where we find ourselves now, Liberian citizenship laws and norms are biased against what I call the rootless immigrant. So those Liberians who left before, during, or after our protracted armed conflict and naturalized abroad are banned from having citizenship. And Liberians of Liberian citizenship, ancestry born abroad, are barred from maintaining their Liberian citizenship after the age of adulthood or majority. And this isn't surprising because citizenship, as some scholars have argued, like Mahmoud Mamdani as well as Brown and Mamby, citizenship is viscerally contested in African countries that have actually experienced the greatest colonial era migration. And although Liberia didn't undergo European colonization, it did experience heightened levels of colonial era migration. The second argument that I make is that the 21st century gridlock or impasse on dual citizenship is really emblematic of Liberia's enduring struggles over citizenship. As of now, Liberia is one of only 7 countries in Africa that prohibits dual citizenship. As a caveat, what's interesting is that Liberia does recognize conditional dual citizenship for those Liberians born abroad to Liberian citizen fathers, but they must declare at the age of majority whether they want to maintain their Liberian citizenship by ancestry or their citizenship by birth. The other 6 countries in Africa that prohibit dual citizenship are Cameroon, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Equatorial Guinea, Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Tanzania. So there's been this sort of transnational trend across the continent where more and more countries in the past 30 years have actually adopted dual citizenship regulations. Some of those regulations are more restrictive than others. The third argument that I make is that domestic and diasporic Liberian actors actually interpret citizenship and dual citizenship quite differently based on what sociologist Norman Long calls their life worlds, which is a really fancy way of saying their lived experiences, or their social locations, another way of saying it, their socioeconomic status. What's interesting is that throughout the course of my research, I discovered that many domestic Liberians view dual citizenship as a zero-sum game. They see it as infringing upon their already very limited access to political, economic, and social rights. But on the other hand, many diasporic Liberians view dual citizenship as a development enabler, as strengthening their social, political, and economic ties to the country such that they can become development actors. Continuing on with my contribution. So what I do is I present a critical framing of citizenship as a continuum of both inclusion and exclusion, as well as development as a process of both degeneration and amelioration, as betterment, but also degeneration. The book also interrogates a sort of presumed symbiotic relationship between development and dual citizenship. So what I argue is that dual citizenship doesn't necessarily lead to development. There isn't necessarily a correlation or even a causation. And in many respects in Liberia, dual citizenship is actually viscerally contested as a development intervention in the country. So what I do is I present different critiques in the literature about dual citizenship. So what I show is that many scholars will argue that dual citizenship is really about extending rights without necessarily extracting responsibilities. They show that there's actually no empirical correlation that shows a relationship between dual citizenship enactment and then an increase in economic contributions by nationals abroad. The book also centers domestic citizenship practices as really key to socioeconomic change. And as a result, I challenge the literature that privileges the citizenship claims of immigrants solely. Lastly, I present critiques of the new neoliberal framing of diasporas and donors as the panacea to Reconstruction, post-war Reconstruction. So what I demonstrate is that diaspora citizenship, as well as development claims, are actually very contested in Liberia, in the same way that donors' development claims are contested across the globe. I also demonstrate that diasporas are both development enablers as well as development spoilers. There's actually a chapter where I talk about the dichotomy of diasporic developmentalism that demonstrates or shows this enabling capacity of diasporas, but also the spoiler capacity of diasporas as it relates to post-war Reconstruction. And then lastly, I showed that diasporas are a silver lining in terms of post-war Reconstruction and development in Liberia, but they are certainly not a panacea or not a silver bullet. So what are some of the theoretical contributions that I make in this book? The first is that I employ and I expand Norman Long's notion of the actor-oriented analysis. And Norman Long demonstrates that development interventions across the globe are contested because of these different interpretations of what development means by different actors. And he says the negotiations over development interventions occur at what he calls the interface. Now, the interface can be a site of divergence where you have confrontation and conflict amongst these actors, but it can also be a site of convergence where there's accommodation and agreement, even though these actors have very different interpretations of what the development policy prescription or development intervention is supposed to achieve. Now, what I do in the book is I further this notion of the interface by moving beyond encounters over actual development projects to really think about what does it mean to be a Liberian transnationally in a sort of ideological exchange amongst different actors about both the pros as well as the cons of development and dual citizenship as a proposed kind of policy-oriented intervention. I also theorize citizenship as a triad or a triangle. Many scholars like Lisa Malky have demonstrated it throughout their research that identities, practices, and relations between people actually transform in the aftermath of violent conflict. Now, Liberia's contested state formation processes really led to political upheavals in the 1980s and protracted armed conflict between 1989 and 2003. So this citizenship triad is supposed to demonstrate these, transformations based on identities, practices, and relations between people. So what I show is that in one node of the citizenship triad is identity, and that's usually a passive form of citizenship. It actually doesn't require anything at all. So this is everything from being born a Liberian to having Liberian ancestry, which you have really no control over. Another form of the citizenship triad is what I call the practices of citizenship. So these are largely active. These are everything from paying taxes to abiding by national laws to developing Liberian capacities. And then there's a set of relations or the interactive form of Liberian citizenship, which is relationships between citizen and citizen, but also relationships between citizen and state. And I take this triad to think of and theorize citizenship or Liberian citizenship as a political economy of belonging. So what I mean by this is that socioeconomic transformation or development, as we know it, really depends on the provision of privileges and protections, so what we might deem as rights, in exchange for the fulfillment of duties and obligations, what we might think about as responsibilities. And this exchange happens in a vice versa kind of manner. And then lastly, I theorize citizenship from the perspective of a post-war African country of relative emigration. And as a result, I expand the contours of the general citizenship literature, which tends to be very Eurocentric in its focus, as well as more abstract in its orientation. Let's move on to my methodological as well as empirical contributions. So this book is based on multi-sided fieldwork that I conducted with over 200 Liberian actors in 5 different capitals. So the capitals of Liberia, Monrovia, the capital of Sierra Leone, Freetown, the capital of Ghana, Accra, the capital of the United Kingdom, London, and the capital of the United States, Washington, DC, where most of us are here in the DMV. Now, this is based on Sassia Sassen's work on the global city, in which she argues that global cities or cities, and particularly capital cities, are sites where citizenship is most contested. So I really wanted to test this hypothesis by looking at interviewees and Liberian actors in these various capital cities across the 3 different continents. So this book has extensive comparative analysis. And this comparative analysis is between what I call homelanders, so those Liberians who either never left the country before, during, or after the war, or may have left for very short periods of time and come back. These are people who consider Liberia their only home, the only home they've actually ever had. And I compare and contrast their perspectives and their experiences with those of returnees. So circular returnees, as well as permanent returnees who've come back in the post-war moment. I also compare and contrast the perspectives and the experiences of executive level policymakers, as well as legislative policymakers. I was able to interview the 4 sponsors of the dual citizenship bill to understand what was the motivation for actually pushing this particular bill forward, and what were the challenges in terms of the suspension therein. Lastly, I compare and contrast the experiences and the perspectives of what Nicholas Van Heer calls the near diaspora. So in the instance for this study, it's those Liberians who reside in places like Sierra Leone and Ghana, and what Van Heer also calls the wider diaspora. So those Liberians who live outside of the sub-region of West Africa, those Liberians in the United Kingdom, as well as the United States. This was important for me because quite often the diasporas literature tends to focus almost exclusively on wider diasporas, when in actuality, the vast majority of so-called global South migrants live in their subregions of origin. They don't migrate outside of that subregion. The book also employs vignettes and verbatim quotes generously from field work. So I take a lot of the quotes from the interviews that I conducted, and I use that as a standing point for enabling people to speak in their own voice, which was incredibly important for me. I want to switch gears to talk about the contributions that I think I'm making to the scholarly canon about Liberia by Liberians. This is very, very, very important for me. And I was incredibly intentional in engaging extensively with the work of Liberian scholars. So I think of myself in this book as something of a conversation facilitator amongst these different scholars. And this is largely in response to the deliberate or non-deliberate erasure within the mainstream literature, in which I read lots of books and lots of articles about Liberia, but I don't see Liberian scholars represented. And I find this to be a form of epistemic violence. So I was intentional again about engaging extensively with these scholars, not only those who've left us, so people like Clarence E. Zamba Liberty or Thomas J., may their souls rest in perfect power, but also those who are still with us and alive and kicking, people like Carl Patrick Burrowes and D. Elwood Dunn and George Clay Kia and Joseph Say Banu and Augustine Kane, some of whom's books I've pictured on the bottom of this particular slide. Now, I want to move into some of the implications for policymaking and practice as it relates to this study. So you'll see from this slide that there is a table that I've generated from the interviews that I've conducted, just to really get a sense of what was the percentage of Liberians I interviewed who either supported dual citizenship, supported dual citizenship with reservations, rejected dual citizenship outright, or were more ambivalent about dual citizenship. So these are the perspectives from the 202 Liberian respondents that I interviewed. And I've highlighted in green those who support dual citizenship in terms of the percentage. About 61% of my respondents actually supported dual citizenship in principle. They saw dual citizenship as a form of strengthening social cohesion, as a form of enabling development, social, political, and economic change. But there was an interesting finding that those who rejected dual citizenship, highlighted in red, 18% of my respondent pool. I will say that I say very clearly in the book, throughout the book, that my respondent percentages are not representative of Liberians worldwide. This is more of exploratory study than a representative study. But if you look at those who rejected dual citizenship, about 18% of them, the vast majority of those who rejected dual citizenship are those based in Monrovia, Liberia. Going back to Sasi Assassin's hypothesis that citizenship is viscerally contested in capital cities, and that those who reject dual citizenship tend to feel as if it's a zero-sum game, going back to the points that I made earlier. But although these figures are not representative of Liberians worldwide, they are corroborated by Afrobarometer Survey. Many of you might know that the Afrobarometer Survey is a Pan-African survey that was developed about 30 years ago that really models sort of political trends in the continent of Africa. There was an Afrobarometer survey conducted in Liberia in 2012, as well as in 2018. And the Afrobarometer survey demonstrated that about 2/3 of Liberians who were surveyed in Monrovia, as well as outside of Monrovia, were actually very, very staunchly opposed to dual citizenship. And this is, again, corroborated by some of the exploratory studies that I conducted. So about 25% of those, or 25 of those whom I spoke to in Monrovia, were very, very staunchly opposed to dual citizenship, outside of about 83 of those Monrovia respondents. So 18% staunchly opposed to dual citizenship. Now, what's interesting is that Liberia actually had a national referendum on December 8th, 2020. And what I discovered in terms of the national referendum results is that although Liberians in the country did not vote 2/3 in terms of the national referendum proposition on dual citizenship did not garner the requisite 2/3 majority in order to pass dual citizenship as a constitutional referendum item, it does show signs that dual citizenship is actually inevitable for Liberia, right? And it's definitely representative of the continental trends in which the vast majority of African countries have enacted dual citizenship in the past 30 years. So even in Montserrado, where the capital city, Monrovia, is, you'll see that although most of the valid ballots demonstrated that there was an even split between those who supported dual citizenship and those who rejected dual citizenship, it's 50%, let's say, who rejected dual citizenship, and about a little bit over 50%, or a little under 50% who supported dual citizenship, which is different from the Afrobarometer Survey data of 2012 and 2018, which showed a vast majority of those who rejected dual citizenship. So even in the capital city, even in Montserrado County, where the capital city is, you see Liberia inching forward slowly but surely towards a more acceptance of dual citizenship than in the past 8 to 10 years. So for me, I see this as emblematic of the fact that Liberia will eventually pass dual citizenship. It's just a matter of time, a matter of perhaps convincing those in the country who feel a sense of threat by those who might reside abroad. However, what I argue is that even though dual citizenship might be an inevitability in Liberia, the country really has to take a gradual, phased approach to try to enact or push the policy prescription forward. And that's precisely because there's so much staunch opposition on the ground. I think one of the things that's really important, and I talk about this in terms of policy recommendations in the book, is that Liberia has to figure out how to reconcile the contradictions between the 1973 Aliens and Nationality Law, which explicitly prohibits dual citizenship, and the 1986 Constitution, which is more permissive. Liberia also had to think about how do we reform our judicial system such that people have a confidence in the judicial process. And then thinking about how do we address inequalities. So most of the Liberians that I interviewed in Monrovia who were staunchly opposed to dual citizenship talked about the fact that there are income inequalities between domestic Liberians and those who've come back as transnational actors who've worked for the government. There are also inequalities around land access. There are also inequalities around transitional justice. And until Liberia deals with these issues, there will continue to be fears around enacting dual citizenship. Now, what I think Liberia needs to do is how do we think about extending rights while also extracting responsibilities from those would-be dual citizens. And there are a number of examples from the continent of Africa. So for instance, Eritrea has, even though Eritrea is one of the 7 countries that prohibits dual citizenship, it taxes a diaspora tax of about 2%. And that 2% goes into building roads. It goes into development processes that are important for the country in terms of moving forward in its socioeconomic transformation. Liberia also might think about, as is the case of Senegal, of allowing voting for diaspora representation in the national legislature, perhaps in lieu of enabling Liberians who've naturalized abroad to actually vote in national elections or to hold public office. Another thing that Sierra Leone has done is that they've established an operational Office of Diaspora Affairs in the presidency. I started this process, but then left Liberia. I'm not sure how far it's gone in terms of establishing that office, but that's something that Liberia can try to do in terms of harnessing the political, economic, and social resources of those who live abroad and dealing with their concerns kind of directly. Another thing that Ethiopia has done, Ethiopia is one of the 7 countries that prohibits dual citizenship, is that it allows non-citizen diasporas to invest, to own shares, and to also set up lending businesses. This is a way of extending rights while also extracting responsibilities. And last but certainly not least, one of the things Liberia can think about in terms of a policy recommendation is granting the right to purchase rural land, because at the moment, only citizens can actually own land, but granting the right to purchase rural land for non-citizen diasporas in exchange for agricultural production in the country as a means of pushing forward our socioeconomic post-war transformation. So I'm going to move forward and talk about why I've decided to embark on this launch tour. So the book has been launched in 2 other countries before this one in the United States. The book was launched first in Monrovia, in the capital of Liberia, because I really wanted to take the book back to Liberia. The book is about Liberia, it's about Liberians. And so I wanted to introduce Liberians to the book and have a really honest conversation about my findings and some of my policy recommendations. So the book was launched in Monrovia on publication day on January 7th. I also had a launch sponsored by the London School of Economics in February. We're doing the launch at Howard now. There will be subsequent launches in Accra, Ghana at the University of Ghana in August, and then a launch to close out the launch tour in Freetown, Sierra Leone at the University of Sierra Leone. And you probably notice all of these cities and countries are places and spaces in which all of my interviews were conducted. So it was really important for me to take the book back to those that I interviewed and my respondents. The rationale for this was that quite often, and many of us on this Zoom webinar are scholars of Africa, quite often research about Africa and or development in the continent is often quite extractive and exploitative. It's about using the resources, using the information, and taking it outside of the continent and using it for particular ends that do not serve the interests of Africans themselves, that do not serve the interests of the continent. So I really wanted my research, and I think that I've succeeded in doing this. I really wanted my research to be emancipatory and transformative, not only transformative in terms of Liberia, but also transformative in terms of lessons learned from the continent of Africa that will ultimately serve the people of Africa and serve the continent itself. So I want to end there by saying thanks for your attention. I believe that the questions and comments will follow the discussant remarks by Carl Patrick Burrowes and Zirra Banu.
Thank you. I will turn it quickly over to Professor Burrowes to give his discussant questions. I got a bit carried away in the beginning, touting this as a Howard homecoming that I forgot to read all of Robtel's bio, and hopefully in the Q&A we can also talk about Robtel is really a scholar activist of this younger generation and a stellar one at that. And so I'm really interested to hear a little bit more about not just this work, but really the kind of the broader, as you can see, this is really, I think, obviously, you know, a calling and a passion, which is captured in this book, but is also certainly goes beyond that. So let me now invite Dr. Burrowes to give some reflections and comments. Thank you.
Okay, well, my first comment is intended to irk the author of the book, because I'm going to refer to her as Dr. Pailey. I haven't had the chance to do this. I'm going to get it out of me. And I wanted to acknowledge that she actually is.
There seems to be a lot of stuff happening, and she's questioning whether or not that.
Amira, you need to mute. Anya, can you mute Amira?
To be done later, as opposed to inserting it into what.
Hello? Should I proceed? Hello?
Yes, I think you can continue now, Dr. Burrowes. Sorry about that.
Oh, all right. Yeah, so basically what I was saying was I wanted to just get it off my chest and refer to the person I've known as Robtel all along as Dr. Pailey. She actually is one of Liberia's most important intellectuals ever. And she's certainly the most important of her generation. And so I say thank you to Howard and thank you to her mom, because you've done a tremendous a job of preparing a scholar. I must say that in some ways, her presentation kind of took the thunder from some of what I wanted to say, because she makes some really important contributions. One, citizenship studies are relatively new. It's a new field, and she's really at the cutting edge of that field. In the context of Africa, citizenship studies tend to be legalistic, and they tend to be anchored in a kind of human rights framework. And the result is that citizenship is cast, in individualistic terms without connecting it closely to the collective element, the collective, dimension. But Robtel was able to offer us something that breaks with that tradition. But I think the significance of Robtel's work is really amplified when you look at it in the context of Liberian studies. And that's because Liberian studies has become ossified in many ways. It has been overly determined by political science. and anthropology of the old school anthropology, cultural anthropology, not the critical anthropology of today. And both of those disciplines have tended towards a great emphasis on structuration, which is something she avoids in her work by coupling structure with action of individuals. And I guess the legacy of Liberian studies, having two dominant disciplines that focus so heavily on structure, is that you come to conceive of so many units in society as stagnant, as static. Ethnic groups and other, groupings of that sort are conceived of as static. And so when you look at it within that context, I couldn't help but be reminded of the phenomena during the war in Liberia and during wars in other parts of Africa as well. You sometimes would hear reports of a baby surviving a massacre because it was covered by an adult body, and eventually the baby emerges. And we know about this because there might have been a photographer or reporter on the scene, or the people responsible for the massacre had fled, and folks living nearby have come to rescue the baby. In effect, I see Robtel's book as the baby in the context of Liberian studies. I'm hoping it's not going to be the last, but it offers to the field the possibility that we can emerge from under this dying paradigm, this corpse. And I say that in part because of the contributions the book makes. Clearly, there's a theoretical contribution, which is so important. I'll give you, just an example. If you go through the bibliography, you see that Robtel employs the work of Baba, of Pierre Bourdieu. There's Foucault, Bell Hooks, and Long, the sociologist who she uses, to inform her work. I mean, these are scholars who have made important contributions to scholarship, broadly speaking, but have had very little to no impact on Liberian studies. And so this is a welcome development in my perspective. And she is very insistent on balancing the possibilities in regards to the theoretical formation of her work in ways that too often end up being polarized. And so scholars choose to be either focused on the structure of society, or they focus, in a voluntaristic way on the actions of individuals. And in this book, Robtel is constantly coming to bring the two into the frame, insisting on it being not either or, but both and. And I saw that woven throughout her work, both in a theoretical sense, and it's easy for some scholars to bow towards, genuflect towards, oh, this is the theory, this is what I intend to do. And then when you look at the methodology or you look at the findings, it's not reflected. But in her case, this insistence on achieving balance, not polarizing, runs throughout. She talks about citizenship both as a passive construct in some cases, and then in other cases being conceived of as very active. And this is reflected in her findings. She captures this, from the interviews that she did, that it's not just her imposing, it's what people, who were interviewed by her actually presented to her. the work is so rich that, you know, I wouldn't want to detain you much further with all of the positive things I could say about the contributions that she offers here. But I certainly want to invite you to get this book and to explore it. It will be very rewarding in that regard. I have some disappointment with the indexing of the book. I thought hopefully in the next edition, it will be indexed more thoroughly, because the concept of belonging, which is so important to the work, for example, is not indexed, you know, in it. And there are other minor, you know, kinds of things like that, but that goes to the publisher. There are questions about the historical framing of the work, and that stems from the way in which Liberian studies is constructed. It's not in any way a weakness of the author's own perspective. As I said in the beginning, in Liberian studies, because of the overdeterminants of political science and anthropology, history tends to be presented in ways that are very frozen and in ways that are not compatible with the framework that Robtel employs. One of the weaknesses of Liberian studies is that indigenous cultures, indigenous societies are often referenced, but are rarely taken seriously or investigated fully, especially in historical terms. And so we don't have studies of citizenship or its equivalent in the context of indigenous societies. And so what we have when Robtel pioneers this work is the sound of one hand clapping, so to speak. It would have been useful to her and to the development of our understanding of citizenship in Liberia had there been a historical equivalent to what she's done, so that we can understand in what ways citizenship as conceived in indigenous societies and cultures has impacted where we are now. But I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Burrowes, for that. I'm going to just turn it right on over to Zirra. And if you want to, again, add your, reflections and comments, and then you can open it up. I want to remind our audience members, participants, to please put your questions, comments, and remarks in the Q&A, and then we'll read those out for Robtel once Zirra has made her remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson, and thank you, Dr. Burrowes, as well as Dr. Pailey for your presentation. I found this book absolutely riveting. I think rarely do we have the chance to get an African perspective and on issues of citizenship and identity. These topics often come up within the context of global migration, particularly towards the West or the global North. But it was absolutely refreshing to see, these accounts theoretically and practically analyzed through this book. From the book, we got to examine contemporary questions, not only from the lenses of politics and economics, but also from historical development and migration and social identity. Essentially, I got to go on a journey to sort of understand from the perspective of Liberians what it meant for them to be Liberian. And I think by extension, that has implications for what it means to be African, especially within this globalized world, this transnational world, where identity is not specifically rooted to geography. So yes, it was an absolutely, interesting account of an African perspective, which is extremely rare. questions that came to mind, through reading this book, and which I also got some perspective on from the first chapter, and also throughout the book with the accounts that were read out, are questions regarding, what makes a Liberian, what makes an African, and essentially what makes you. How do we conceptualize identity, and how does that iterate into state formation and then into development? Dr. Pailey, as she highlighted in her presentation of the book, had this discourse between the passive, active, and interactive forms of identity. And so I think we saw that throughout the book. The first chapter gave a wonderful account from various perspectives, and she brought, examples of cases from people, their first names being Bey and Teta, Aisha and James. And we got to see this real physical iteration of identity, and what that means between domestic Liberians and also those in the diaspora, through a face-off with the students or protesters from the University of Liberia, and then also from lobbyists from the diaspora, who do not, in this case, have the agency to become citizens in a country that they identify by heart as, being a part of. In the second chapter that looks at dual citizenships and its discontents, we see issues of conflict and migration and post-war recovery. And we get to see defining moments in Liberia's discourse with dual citizenship, and also tactics that domestic Liberians and also transnational Liberians use to sort of push for their agency. The third chapter is titled "Give Me Your Land or I'll Shoot," and aptly so, because issues of citizenship and identity often, crystallize in the form of ownership, right, of land, something concrete within a country, which of course is in contention in this case, where citizenship is limited to people of Liberian and African descent. We get to see perspectives from the fourth chapter in terms of what it means to be rooted or rootless, and that is, the engagement between the domestic Liberians and those that are Liberian, perhaps, but not residing in the country. And then the fifth chapter gives an excellent analysis of the dichotomy between what she calls diasporic developmentalism. And then we see issues or differences between state building and nation building. It was really interesting for me to see, that tussle, what exactly state building entails and what nation building entails, which, are fairly similar, but not quite the same thing. We get to understand also a little bit the associations between transnationalism and corruption, and how that feeds into domestic Liberians' perception of the impact that dual citizenship will have on them. As she mentioned, it's typically seen as a zero-sum game by domestic Liberians. And so we get to see why from this chapter. She also aptly highlights issues of budget transparency and how the response from security forces and the police sort of led to lost hope in terms of security. So as I mentioned, there's lots to talk about, in this book. I'm sure there's lots of people that have questions as well. So I'll limit what, all my thoughts at this point, and probably bring up some questions later on. But really, I thought this was a really riveting and essential piece of analysis in terms of African studies in general, and also studies on Liberia. It really brings together, historical perspective, practical perspectives, social perspectives, and also the issues of political economy in this form. And so for that, I believe it was absolutely essential. Yes, so as I mentioned, there is, quite a bit to talk about in the book. I can see some questions, and I could, read them out if we move on to that section now. But really quickly, I could pose a quick question if you don't mind. One of it would be, Dr. Pailey, how do you see domestic issues of agency and the tussle between domestic and diasporic actors? What for me was really interesting in this book was the facts, or how I got to learn of this pronounced agency from the perspective of domestic Liberians. As you mentioned, they actually were able to stall, as you mentioned in the book and in the presentation, they're actually able to stall the push for dual citizenship by 10 years. So from 2008 to 2018, I think often that's counter to how we understand, or at least conceptualize, the agency of domestic Africans as opposed to the diaspora. So from your perspective, what reasons do you see as responsible for that? You also mentioned Senegal's case of pro-dual citizenship and Eritrea's case. Those perhaps are in-betweens between, or rather the two extremes, between what is present today in Liberia. Cases of countries like Mali, for example, that used to bar dual citizenship, but now have liberalized that process. What impact do you foresee that might have on countries, and then also on identity throughout Africa? What lessons can countries and individuals at the same time learn from Liberia's case? And you have some recommendations in the book. If you'd also let us know what you would recommend as the path forward. You aptly recognized the issue of empirical violence, right, against Africans. And perhaps that's part of the issue that a lot of domestic Liberians have captured or have conceptualized in their position to sort of limit dual citizenship. How can those fears be allayed based on your perspective and people that you spoke with? So if you wouldn't mind starting with that, and we will move on also to participant questions. Thank you very much, Dr. Pailey.
Thank you so much, Zirra. Lots of questions, but I actually want to start. I'll answer some of the questions that you mentioned, but I actually want to maybe respond to some of the things that you and Dr. Burrowes, whom I refer to as Dr. B kind of affectionately, but I have to remember that I can call him Carl now because I think he's giving me the thumbs up. Carl, I think one of the things you mentioned about how did indigenous populations conceive of and practice citizenship pre-settler establishment, and what do indigenous populations, how do they conceive of and practice citizenship, or descendants of indigenous populations conceive of and practice citizenship now, I think is a big gap that I left open, because I'm a pseudo historian. I believe that history needs to be validated and valued in our research, because nothing exists in a vacuum, right? And I was very, very intentional about ensuring that I didn't go into the archives, but I tried to somehow dig up as much information that I could find from historians like you, historians like D.L. Wood-Dunn, historians like Joseph Say Gwanu, and then historians like Clarence E. Zamba Liberty. So I think there is a gap, and I'm glad that you mentioned that. So I hope that Liberians and Liberianists who focus on the continent or focus on the country of Liberia will take this up as a torch that I'm passing on to historians who want to do that sort of investigative work, go back into the archives, and they are colonial archives, but we can read against the grain in these colonial archives, right? Really, really important in terms of comparing, contrasting our 21st century manifestations of citizenship and what it means to be a Liberian that I take up so intently in my book. So thank you for bringing that up. That's absolutely important. In terms of the indexing of belonging, we'll definitely have a side conversation on that, because I did the indexing, so I can't blame Cambridge University Press for leaving those out. But it was definitely a process and a steep learning curve. So I definitely want to hear more about how I could have indexed it differently, because the idea of belonging is one that I really want to center in my research and I've tried to do. So now I'll go to some of the questions that Zirra talked about. Yes, in the book, quite often when we read about diasporic communities or diasporic societies, there's a tendency, as I mentioned in the literature, to focus only on immigrants, right? So what do diasporas believe about dual citizenship? What do diasporas believe about development? And I didn't want to do that in this book. I really wanted to compare and contrast, talk about, again, the continuities and discontinuities about being a Liberian domestically, but also being a Liberian transnationally or diasporic Liberians. So what I try to do throughout the book is to demonstrate that in the same way that diasporic Liberians had an impact on the bill's introduction, domestic Liberians also had an impact on the suspension of the bill through their resistance, through the Afrobarometer Survey saying that they're very, very staunchly opposed because of the socioeconomic conditions in the country. But then also the fact that we just had this referendum and the 2/3 majority vote was not what we were able to achieve. So there's something to be said about domestic agency in the same way that it's important to think about diasporic agency. And what I do is I try to pit those two against each other, but also in the research and in my findings, I realized that the vast majority of my respondents did think about dual citizenship as a positive policy prescription. So those kind of polarized notions about the demerits or the merits of dual citizenship were actually counter to the major findings that I came up with, is the fact that diasporic Liberians support dual citizenship in principle in the same way that many domestic Liberians support dual citizenship in principle. But it's the implementation thereof that people start getting very, very concerned about. So for instance, some of the questions that came up in my interviews were, can a would-be dual citizen become the president of Liberia? That became people were very skittish about that. Can a potential dual citizen become the Minister of Defense, given that there might be divided loyalties? Can a potential dual citizen own vast tracts of land because they have the economic wherewithal to do so? So when you talk about the nitty-gritty in terms of the implementation of a dual citizenship bill that I believe is eventually going to be passed in Liberia, that's where Liberia needs to do the work in terms of strengthening our judicial systems, in terms of really addressing these inequalities around income, inequalities around land ownership, so forth and so on. So I think, yes, it was important for me to think about what are the differences, but then also the similarities amongst diasporic perspectives, but also domestic perspectives, and talking about domestic agency as equally as important as diasporic agency in my research. In terms of lessons learned for other parts of the continent, the 7 countries that have prohibited dual citizenship, I don't go into very much detail about speculating why that is, but I do state that many scholars like Bronwyn Bambi and Mahmoud Mamdani have again argued that those countries that experienced the greatest colonial era migration are the ones that are most viscerally contested in terms of citizenship architecture. So for instance, in the case of Eritrea, one of the reasons that Eritrea has not enacted dual citizenship is because of that long protracted war with Ethiopia. So they don't want Ethiopians to be able to have citizenship in the same way that Ethiopians don't want Eritreans to have dual Eritrean Ethiopian citizenship. The other countries like Cameroon, DRC, Tanzania have also experienced heightened levels of colonial era migration. So it goes back to that theorizing about Mahmoud Mamdani and Bronwyn Manby. And it's not just colonial era migration as it relates to European settlers, but also colonial era migration as it relates to other Africans from other parts of the continent then settling in these countries. Because when the continent was able to fight the yoke of colonialism, we didn't reconcile those colonial borders that we inherited. We didn't have an anti-Berlin conference to say, yes, our continent has been carved up by colonial forces. How do we reconcile the differences? How do we reconcile the fact that ethnic groups were split up arbitrarily? How do we reconcile the fact that people have allegiances to more than one particular geographic locale? So I think perhaps in the 21st century, we need to have a conversation about why we didn't reconcile those the carving up of the continent by the European Conference. But I think the African Union is trying to respond to that by pushing forward the African continental free trade area. So a lot of people have demonstrated that the continent doesn't trade with itself. So countries in the continent would rather trade with former colonial powers than they would with their sub-regional neighbors. They're also trying to reconcile that by twinning the AFCFTA with something like a continent-wide free movement of persons protocol. Now, regions like ECOWAS and increasingly the economic community of East Africa have regional protocols that enable their sub-regional neighbors to come and establish businesses and settlement without necessarily having to have visas. More and more countries across the continent are recognizing that you can't have a free movement of services and goods without having free movement of people. So I think there are continental trends in which we recognize that opening up liberalizing our citizenship architecture is not only, it doesn't only make economic sense, but it also helps with the social cohesion. It also helps with ensuring that the continent is one that we all can sort of share in its greatness. And we can also maintain that it is our continent. So for instance, a number of years ago, the African Union enabled the diaspora to be designated as the 6th region of the continent. So I think across the continent, there's a recognition that diasporas are a force to reckon with, that Africans abroad are an important socioeconomic as well as political strength. And how do you ensure that they feel as if they are a part of the process of continental transformation is perhaps to open up our citizenship laws. So I think there have been a number of things that have happened in the 30 years to demonstrate that we have to do things differently in the continent. And in the 21st century, one of the only ways to do that is to think about diasporic and domestic transformation as being one part and parcel of moving the continent forward, whether at the sub-regional level, at the national level, or the continental level. So I think I'll end there, but hopefully that answers some of the questions that you posed, Zirra.
Yes, certainly. Thank you. And we have a host of questions that have been trickling in from the chat. I'll read in the order that it was received. So we have a question from Sarah who says, Dr. Pailey, what a rich read. I'm curious to hear about your thoughts about the ways that Liberian dual citizenship could affect diasporic Liberians' politics of belonging if they live outside of their homeland. Do you anticipate some countries like the USA being unwilling to recognize dual citizenship from African nations as complicating the politics of belonging?
Yeah, I mean, I think I try to expand it beyond just the politics of belonging in the book to think about the political economy of belonging. So again, going to that notion of the fact that socioeconomic transformation depends on this exchange between the rights and responsibilities. Quite often when we think about dual citizenship or expanding citizenship to more than just one, we think about the rights therein, right? But we rarely ever think about the responsibilities. And I think if you think about it in that way, in terms of the political economy of belonging, it brings back the other end of the spectrum, which is the responsibilities. So I think one of the major concerns that a lot of, at least Liberians that I interviewed talked about is, okay, so if you open the Pandora's box of dual citizenship, what would be required of would-be dual citizens? Would they be required to pay taxes on land? And then how do we monitor that to ensure that it's happened, given that our judicial systems are so weak? And there's a lack of enforcement of even the laws that exist on the books now. So I think one of the things that's important is to recognize that when we're talking or having this sort of public discourse about the politics of belonging, is to take it back to the political economy of belonging and thinking about, again, the provision of privileges and protections in exchange for the fulfillment of duties and obligations. I think many countries in the continent have reciprocity with the United States. So for those countries that have enacted dual citizenship, it is possible, for instance, for a Malian who lives in the United States to maintain US citizenship and Malian citizenship. But what I often ask my Liberian contemporaries who live in the diaspora and who have naturalized abroad, and because of our aliens and nationality law have revoked their Liberian citizenship, is would they be willing, if dual citizenship were enacted in Liberia, to pay taxes in the United States as well as pay taxes in Liberia? And then it becomes a bit of a silence, right? Because everybody's pushing for those rights, but not thinking about the responsibility side of the equation, which is why a lot of scholars will say that there really is no empirical correlation between enacting dual citizenship and increasing the economic contributions of nationals abroad. It's because there's nothing really asked of would-be dual citizens, of dual citizens. That responsibility almost becomes erased, right? So I think that we need to enter into the public discourse by thinking about what does it mean to be a Liberian through and through? What does it mean to be a Liberian abroad with the rights, but also, I would say, most importantly, with the responsibilities? There's a chapter in the book where I talk about, and I think, Zirra, you asked this question, I didn't answer it earlier, but I talk about the whole idea of a diasporacy. And what I mean by this diasporacy is a term that I coined to talk about the administration of Ellen Johnson Sirleaf for 12 years. And I call her administration a diasporacy because what happened for 12 years was that we valued and we favored those Liberians who came from abroad. We placed them in very, very high levels of political leadership in the executive branch of government, myself included. I mean, I was a 25-year-old idealist who moved back to Liberia immediately after grad school and became part speechwriter to Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. But a lot of Liberians who were in the country at the time said, well, what about us? What about valuing our capacities? What about valuing our experiences? Why is our experience and our capacities not important? And so I think one of the reasons, and this is documented throughout the book, that there was so much pushback against dual citizenship is that those who came back were paid significantly more than those who lived in the country, just by virtue of the fact that they'd graduated from universities abroad or had done well professionally abroad and came back, were paid sometimes $15,000 a month, which to the chagrin of a lot of Liberians who lived in the country was a travesty, right? If we say we're committed to socioeconomic transformation and we want diasporas to be involved in that process, why are we privileging them so extensively in this way? So I would say, yes, going back to, whether it's the politics of belonging or the political economy of belonging, thinking about that equation as a rights plus responsibility, that citizenship is about both, not about one or the other.
Exactly. Thank you very much, Dr. Pailey. I remember towards the conclusion, you also highlighted about extending rights and extracting responsibilities as part of the discourse to citizenship. So it was great to hear that. Christian asks or says, first of all, thank you so much for sharing with us today. Earlier, you were talking about your criticisms of the neoliberal view of diasporic citizenship. I was wondering if you could explain some of your specific critiques and how realistic or unrealistic this neoliberal view is.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So what I mean by the neoliberal framing of diasporas and donors as the panacea to post-war reconstruction. So when we think about neoliberalism as an ideology, it's all about market forces prevailing. It's about rolling back the state, its regulatory function, right? And I think in the discourse around diasporas and development, it's all about pushing the state back such that diasporas can be the be all and end all, the silver bullets of post-war reconstruction. And what I argue is that actually, no, it's domestic citizens who are bound to socioeconomic transformation in a way that diasporic citizens or diasporic nationals aren't, because they don't necessarily have a vested interest in ensuring that development actually prevails, right? So what I say is that, yes, diasporas are important. Yes, donors are important in terms of post-war reconstruction, but it's domestic citizens whose capacities need to be valued, whose capacities need to be generated in order for socioeconomic transformation to move forward. So this neoliberal framing of diasporas as the be-all, as the silver bullets of post-war reconstruction is a notion that I push against, because I think what it does is it invalidates the perspectives, it invalidates the contributions, it invalidates the contributions to socioeconomic transformation that domestic citizens ultimately are responsible for, but then it also invalidates what the state's responsibility is to those domestic citizens, right? So if you value diasporas and say that, remittances are the key to socioeconomic transformation, then the state can abdicate its responsibility and say, we don't have to necessarily invest in healthcare. We don't necessarily have to invest in infrastructure. We don't necessarily have to invest in education, because we can rely on the remittances to take the place of that. When we have a responsibility to the state, we have a responsibility to domestic citizens. And there are a number of policymakers I interviewed who said that during my interviews, even a former minister of finance who said if it were not for remittances, the kinds of demands that domestic citizens would place on the state would be actually really, really high. But because their brothers and sisters and aunts and uncles are sending remittances from abroad, we can kind of take it easy. The kinds of responsibilities that we would have to take on are not necessarily at the forefront of our domestic and post-war reconstruction efforts. So what I would say is, in terms of that critique of the neoliberal framing, is that diaspora shouldn't be the be-all and end-all of post-war reconstruction. Donors shouldn't be the be-all and end-all of post-war reconstruction. They should just be complementary to the process of the state taking a full responsibility and domestic citizens being at the forefront of pushing policies forward as it relates to socioeconomic transformation. So that's basically what I mean by the neoliberal framing is the centering of diaspora, centering of donors as the be all and end all of post-war reconstruction, and almost an erasure of the state and the state responsibility, and also an erasure of domestic citizens and their contributions to post-war recovery and post-war reconstruction.
Thank you. I think we have another question that relates slightly to that, so we'll revert back. But just to answer in the order it was received, someone put in a question earlier, and the question, and first of all, the comment says, "Wonderful presentation, thank you." Michael asks, can you tell us what first made you realize that debates around DC were so useful for understanding broader questions about development? Was it a specific observation or a conversation?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I kind of alluded to this earlier, but I worked with Ellen Johnson Sirleaf's administration for the first 4 years of her very first term. So between 2007 and 2011, I worked in the executive office of the presidency. And I was actually responsible for, because I'd done my master's thesis on what were the political, economic, and social implications of Liberians moving back during this rise in post-war reconstruction, the sort of next post-war moments in Liberia. And so the president basically said to me, come up with the strategy for engaging with Liberians abroad. And throughout this process of trying to come up with the strategy for harnessing, again, the political, economic, and social resources of Liberians abroad, I had conversations with Liberians across the sub-region. I had conversations with Liberians in Europe, in the United States, so forth and so on. And many of them kept saying to us, why are you asking us to then contribute our political, economic, and social resources when you don't even allow us to have citizenship, given that so many of us naturalized abroad during the protracted armed conflict and now have formally severed ties with the country. We can't even own land in the country. So how dare you come to us now begging for us to be involved in the post-war reconstruction process and doing it through this sort of government office. And I realized that for them, it wasn't just about being able to own land. It wasn't just about being able to vote in national elections. It really was about feeling a certain sense of being aggrieved that through no fault of our own, we had to flee, right? Some of us made the choice to flee further afield than within the subregion. And we're being doubly penalized for naturalizing abroad because many of them felt like they had to. And that's a debate that, you know, we can talk about a little bit later. And so you formally severed ties with us. We're no longer a part of the nation state formally, but you want us to contribute. So there's something very antithetical about that ask. When we feel a certain sense of being aggrieved, we feel a sense that the war was brutal, that we lost our family members, many of us lost resources, and we're trying to build back up our lives. And one of the reasons many of us naturalize is because we wouldn't have certain rights and privileges outside of the country otherwise. And now you're asking us to contribute our talent, treasure, and time to a state that doesn't even recognize us as belonging, to a state that doesn't even recognize us as citizens. So why don't you go back and change your citizenship laws, and then we can have a conversation. But many of them also said that even though we have this sense of feeling aggrieved, it doesn't stop us from sending remittances to our family, because our family is still very much connected to us. Again, that whole idea of practicing citizenship without necessarily having the formal ties to citizenship was one that kept coming up in conversation after conversation after conversation. And then I realized, wait, there's something here in terms of a research project. So I started interviewing Liberians in the country about what they felt about a proposed dual citizenship bill that had just been introduced. So I moved to Liberia in 2007, and the proposed dual citizenship bill was introduced in 2008. So I started having these sort of informal conversation with domestic Liberians as well as diasporic Liberians. And I realized that it was more than just the socioeconomic. It was also that idea, the sort of metaphysical belongingness that was equally important to the conversation and the public discourse. So I think that's where that seed got planted, is being asked to come up with a strategy for diasporic engagement, having conversations with Liberians abroad, many of whom had naturalized, asking me questions about why are you even asking us to be involved, and doing so with the government as a partner when the state has effectively severed ties with us, formal ties with us, and says that we don't belong.
I think that's so interesting. And you have different cases and accounts, which I think you highlight as well in the book, of people being rooted, for example, in Liberia, but not specifically always feeling Liberian. And so that happens sometimes with foreigners, but then also with citizens as well. I think with the foreign case, you highlighted cases of other Africans, just who cannot also become citizens in the country, you know, feeling that disconnect. But then also non-Africans. There's an account of a Liberian man who asserts that, sorry, not Liberian, Lebanese man who asserts that, you know, he, you know, and Lebanese in general can't be Liberian. So that interaction is interesting to see from different perspectives. But this is also relates to the next question. Robert asks, is the Eritrean diaspora tax a good model to follow? The Eritrean government has used the tax in a coercive way to keep diaspora families in line. If you do not pay the tax, you cannot visit your families at home. So this question of extracting responsibility and perhaps connecting that with development, is this a good model to follow? Are there other models? How can this model be better implemented or applied? What are your perspectives on this?
Yes, it's a good question, because, you know, many people will argue that the Eritrean state is a very repressive state, and it's not necessarily a state that we would want to emulate in terms of Liberia taking on some of, you know, the whole idea of, you know, mandatory military service and so forth and so on. But the reason I like that idea in principle, not in terms of the way it's implemented, is going back to that notion of extracting responsibilities while also extending rights. And the question that I asked a lot of my respondents about, would you be willing to pay taxes in the United States as well as Liberia if you were granted both citizenships? And there being a certain level of silence, right? So I think there is a way to somehow implement that. I haven't thought extensively about what that would look like in actuality, in practice, but the example that I gave at the very end of one of the slides is enabling diaspora Liberians who have naturalized abroad, for instance, to own vast tracts of agricultural land that's been laying fallow. I mean, Liberia is I think has a third of the Upper Guinea forest, but we've got so much land that is just not developed. And there's a sort of notion that says if you plant a seed in Liberia, it'll just sprout without any sort of assistance. So we've got all this agricultural land that's not developed. Could the government then enter into an agreement with diaspora Liberians in the interim? Because as I mentioned during my presentation, I think dual citizenship will eventually happen. It's just a matter of time. But in the interim period, one of the things that the government could do is to say, we will give you 10 acres of agricultural land in Nimba County or in Lofa County or wherever else in terms of the sub-political division, in exchange for you developing that land and paying paying taxes on that land. That's a way to extract responsibilities while also extending rights, given that land ownership is strictly tied to citizenship. So without citizenship, you can't own land. So that's a sort of interim measure that can be implemented in the country that doesn't necessarily follow the model of Eritrea in terms of tactically using the diaspora tax to be repressive, but it's a way of opening up land ownership for people to be involved in that process, while also ensuring that the state is able to get money and resources from that taxation to develop the country further. I mean, I want to bring Dr. Burrowes into the conversation because I'm sure he's got some ideas about this as well, in terms of taxation without representation or other measures that you've seen in other countries that have worked that might be a happy medium in the interim, such that diaspora Liberians who've naturalized abroad don't feel as if they have completely formally severed ties. They feel as if they are part of the nation state from afar, while we work on ensuring that the bread and butter issues around healthcare and education and infrastructure are dealt with by the state.
Well, on the spur of the moment, my reaction would be that it might be best to prioritize the kinds of initiatives that have been undertaken by Senegal and others, because if you're dealing with a population that feels aggrieved, they need to feel a sense of representation. And then the issue of land ownership and the productive use of the land as a means of bringing revenue to the state can then be explored as an option. With that political representation, there would also come a sense of ownership of whatever economic measures are being implemented. You have someone at the table who is helping to forge policy on behalf of that external community. So I think it's a question of ordering as well. With Eritrea, I don't know that there's any representation, and they have not allowed dual citizenship. But then you have this taxation. So it's responsibility without rights in effect, puts the cart the other way around. Yeah.
Yes, I think that's really interesting to think, because some economists also argue that for all foreign nationals living in countries like the US or the UK, that might be having access to certain economic opportunities that domestic citizens might not have. Some of them argue that from a developmental perspective, it'd be best if they are taxed higher, or they are mandated to remit a certain amount of money to their countries. So within this context of representation and responsibility and development, and the issue of belonging as well, that raises certain questions as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think Dr. Burrowes, Carl's point is well taken, and yours as well, Zirra. I mean, I was just thinking about, and I try to do this throughout the book, is to demonstrate that diasporas are not homogenous, right? So, for instance, a former refugee in a camp in Accra, the way that person or that seamstress conceives and practices citizenship, Liberian citizenship, would be very different from someone like a business manager who makes almost $200,000 a year, and has certain access and privileges and the economic wherewithal to practice citizenship quite differently. So I think if we're thinking about taxes, we also have to think about the fact that diasporas are very, very heterogeneous. They're heterogeneous in terms of why they left Liberia in the first place. They're heterogeneous in terms of where they ended up. They're heterogeneous in terms of their economic profiles. They're heterogeneous in terms of what is possible for them in terms of engagement with the nation state and citizens in the nation state. So we would also have to think about the various types of diasporas and how to engage with them differently and meet them where they are.
Exactly. We had one question just pop in. We were anticipating one final question, but as the previous question, I think would be a good wrap up. And if the audience would permit for a push of about 5 minutes, just to accommodate this new question really quickly. Kona asks, what about those of us who are foreign born? There are those of us who were born overseas in the 60s and 70s and even earlier who returned home and lived as Liberians. What happens to us, and what happens to foreign-born children of the past 20 years? Speaking of globalization, change, development, you've mentioned also that it's probably a matter of time before, dual citizenship is permitted. So at what point, what's the inflection point that we might see that change, and what would it take to get there?
Yeah, it's a good question, Kona, and I know why he's asked it. What's interesting in the research is in one of the chapters, the whole idea of being rooted versus rootless. I actually bring up examples of the sort of examples of Liberians born abroad to Liberian citizen fathers. And that's one thing that we haven't really talked about, is the gendered nature of our citizenship laws. So the Aliens and Nationality Law doesn't permit, or actually the Constitution and the Aliens and Nationality Law of Liberia does not permit Liberian citizen women to pass on citizenship to their children born abroad. So one of the intentions of the 2008 dual citizenship bill was to reconcile that very gendered discriminatory practice of not allowing Liberian citizen women to pass on, citizenship to their children born abroad. And that's still very much a law that's embedded in our Aliens and Nationality Law. So the example that I brought up is there was a young man who was born in Kenya to Liberian citizen parents, both his mother and father, born in Liberia, who were citizens at the time of his birth. So he could have opted for Kenyan citizenship by birth, but then he ended up moving to the United States and spent a number of years there. So he could have also been eligible for US citizenship by naturalization. He actually moved back to Liberia and maintained his Liberian citizenship by ancestry. So I speculate in the book that there are actually more and more Liberians like this example who've maintained their Liberian citizenship by ancestry after the age of majority. But as Kona mentions, there are also Liberians who were born abroad to Liberian citizen parents who didn't maintain their Liberian citizenship by ancestry and maintain their citizenship, their foreign citizenship by birth. So what happens to them? I think one of the reasons why we need to push for trying to make our citizenship architecture more equal is that we give a space and an opportunity and recognition and center the perspectives of these Liberians. Because many of them were also, Kona mentioned those who were born in the 60s and the 70s before the political upheavals in the country, but the number of Liberians by ancestry I interviewed who were in their early 20s, who said that they feel this sort of deep metaphysical connection to the country. Many of them had never even been to Liberia when I interviewed them, but by virtue of osmosis, of social cohesion, and being taught by their parents about how important this country is to them, they sort of inherited this deep connection to Liberia. And I think one of the ways of making them feel whole again is to ensure that they are able to maintain their Liberian citizenship by ancestry after the age of majority. And there are a number of ways that we can push for this. Again, looking back at our citizenship laws, ensuring that the current laws that exist on the books are actually implemented such that it gives those Liberians in the country a sense of assurance that the laws won't be, disregarded or flouted. But then I think there are Liberians who were born abroad to Liberian citizen parents who maintain very strong ties to the country, who come back regularly, who have established businesses, who have contributed, who have maintained, contributions of time, talent, and treasure, who don't have Liberian citizenship. So I think the more we talk about these cases, the more we highlight these cases, I think a more compelling case can be made for those who are a bit skeptical to say, once a Liberian, always a Liberian, but there are also rights and responsibilities therein. Just pushing that as much as possible, I think, is one of the ways to open up the discourse. So it's not just about, oh, you left, you severed ties, but what about those who didn't leave, who were born abroad and didn't sever ties, but through no fault of their own? We've got this law on the book that says once you reach the age of 23, you have to decide. So yeah, I think we just have to continue talking. And beyond talking, I think one of the recommendations I've made to Liberians abroad who are pushing for dual citizenship is to not push for dual citizenship in the confines of your homes in the United States or the United Kingdom. Come to Liberia, engage in a conversation with those who are domestically rooted, get a sense of why they feel a sense of, being aggrieved, and work towards making sure that those misgivings or fears are allayed. I think that's the only way to do it, because I think quite often in the public discourse, Liberians abroad talk about dual citizenship from outside of Liberia, expecting those in the country to automatically agree because it's just the right thing to do. But I think there has to be a lot of reconciliation on both ends, and realizing, as someone said in my interviews, Liberia is pretty much the only country we have. We can live abroad for a number of years, but ultimately all of us want to come back at some point.
Yes, and I think you also have some anecdotal evidence in some of the interviews you had, where there's this lady who talks of her daughter, who I don't believe had been to Liberia, but she balances, things on her head, and she is Liberian by heart, and it's sort of the idea of identity and belonging just being in the blood of a person. So these themes were extremely insightful to read and learn about. But we'll move to the final question right before we wrap up. And thank you, Tatiana, for waiting, because I think this is a good question to sort of, wrap things up in general. She says, you might have already addressed this, but how do you think dual citizenship enhances a nation? Sort of bringing all these themes together and making it concrete for people and states and nations. How can a nation be enhanced from dual citizenship? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think Zirra talked about one of the chapters where I talk about the difference between state building and nation building. So state building is really about building the capacity of the state to deliver, and nation building is about developing that social cohesion, that sense of belonging on both ends. And it requires Liberian capacities, it requires Liberian resources, or the resources of the country at hand. I think one of the ways that dual citizenship could enhance that sense of cohesion is that it shows that we are effectively a country of a migratory history, and we can't escape that history, given that, in 1847, when the nation state was established, it was established on migratory principles. And in the book, what I talk about is that, to a certain extent, nobody can say that they're descendants of indigenous populations in Liberia, because we've all come from somewhere else, right? So even those who would be pushing for their sense of indigeneity, indigenous populations started migrating to the territory that is modern day Liberia in the 12th, 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries. So if we think about that immigration, IMMI, as starting even before, Dr. Burrowes talks about this throughout his book, between the Kola Forest and the Salty Sea is that we are a migratory nation. So even those indigenous populations are also migratory. So if we think about that, you know, just in terms of the historical as well as the symbolic, then we can say that we all effectively belong to that nation state. Whether we weren't born in the country or whether we immigrated or immigrated, at the end of the day, migration is a part, it's a part of the state's DNA. So I think what dual citizenship forces us to think about is, because of this protracted armed conflict, it forces us to reconcile with that migratory history and to say, well, what does it mean to be a Liberian? Perhaps one of the fundamental tenets of being a Liberian is being an immigrant. And if we say that, then we can say those who live abroad are just as much a part of the nation state as those who are domestically rooted.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pailey, Dr. Burrowes, and we'll pass it on to Dr. Johnson. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you. Thanks very much, Zirra, for that. And actually, that's a great note to, I think, to end things on in many ways. I want to thank Robtel for coming and sharing her book. This is clearly a rich manuscript that you've written here, and with a lot of, I think, really great empirical data that's, I think, going to be fascinating to read. I want to make sure that everybody in our audience saw that we've put in the chat actually where you can download the introduction for free, and then also where you can purchase the book. We had a flyer. I don't know, Anya, if you can put up the flyer, which also gives the information in terms of where to find the book. It's, I'm sure, on Amazon.com, but also if you go to the publisher, you can get a 20% discount. Great. So we have all of that up there as well. I want to also just invite, I want to, I guess, wrap things up because we didn't want to go too much over time. And again, thank Robtel for really a fascinating conversation, Dr. Burrowes and Zirra, Banu, for engaging in a, I think, a really rich discussion around very, very timely issues. In Liberia, but gosh, right here in the United States, of course, where many of us are here now. I wanted to also, though, just invite, because as I said before, this is a bit of a homecoming. I know I have some of my colleagues and folks online too, and the nice thing about the Zoom format that we chose is you all can actually unmute yourselves and undisguise yourselves, show your faces, and come and give a bit of a shout out to Robtel before we leave. But for the rest of our audience, you can feel free to sign off now. And thank you very much for coming, and we'll look forward to seeing you at our next event. But those of us who are interested in our little homecoming,
thank you, Robtel.
Come and join us
Very
now.
wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
Great. So proud of you.
Not say anything, just come and see. I'm
coming there.
Oh, God.
It's not like for dead for me.
Dr. David, we can hear you, but we can't see you.
Oh, I wanted to say something to Robtel.
Please do. I'm sure she'll be excited to hear from you.
Robtel, are you hearing me?
Yes.
This is Wilfred David.
Hi, Dr. David.
How are you?
Well,
I wanted to say three things, covering your life course pattern. To remember our mutual friend, the late Professor Braithwaite in English, right?
mm-hmm.
One, and if he were alive, he would have spoken to you, but gone. And then the Oxford people been very instrumental in your development, and the Guyanese woman who is now the master of University College, Oxford, Barnum Amos, who was the head of SOS when you were there. and they're all proud of you. But anyway, it was nice seeing you. I mean, you know, and keep on the good work. The LSE is my, you know, I did my first degree at LSE and UCL. So I know that part of London very well. And I'm so happy that you ended up there. But you know, I hope that you will end up at Oxford. I was that Panacea will get you at University College at a later stage. But keep on the good work.
Thank you so much, Dr. David. So I have to say something about Dr. David. When I was a senior at Howard, I begged Dr. David if I could take his, what was the name of that course that I took as a senior when it was a graduate course? Something about development.
Right, yeah.
What was the name of the course?
Well, probably development and planning in Africa.
Development and planning in Africa. Dr. David, so you planted the seed of what I would eventually study at the PhD level, and you didn't even realize it.
I didn't know.
Thank you.
Well, good that I contribute, you know. And my wife, Dr. Peggy David, says hello.
Please extend my greetings back to her as well.
Okay.
Anyone else want to chime in before we sign off? It really is nice having you on campus, if only virtually. Next time we'll make sure to do something in person. And Dr. Burrowes, it's great to have you back on campus as well. Hopefully we can, obviously the issue, as we were saying before we started this, the panel, the issue of citizenship, political community, transnational identities is so timely at the moment. There's really a lot that I'm sure we're going to be doing, and we have been doing around the issue. So we hope to rope you in our future activities and programming around this issue.
And Krista, it's one that's also quite a bit in the news there in England. Robtel with David Lammy, the shadow Labor Secretary, you know, who is being denied, you know, Englishness, you know.
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't read that.
Yeah. There was a story in The Guardian, you know, where somebody called into this radio program and was saying that, you know, he could never be English, you know. I mean, he can be British, but never, you know, an Englishman. So,
yeah, I mean, these issues of belonging legitimately are
exactly.
everywhere, aren't they? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Very interesting. Well, good. Well, thank you all very much. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your afternoon, and we look forward to seeing you at our next event.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.